going to start with one of our leading historians, Father Leopold Glueckert, who will speak to us this morning on the historical context of Teresa. And Father Leopold has his doctorate in history from Loyola University in Chicago, and taught for many years in Washington at the Washington Theological Union, taught courses in Carmelite history and Carmelite spirituality. And he's written several books on the history of the order, and is a frequent lecturer and speaker. And I really hate to do this to you because he's horrible with puns. I mean, I just... I probably should reopen that bar. By the time that Father Leopold finishes, we'll all be ready for a glass of something. If you like puns, you're in for a delightful next hour. If they make you cringe, well, I didn't bring any liquor with me, I'm sorry. But I would like to introduce now Father Leopold Glueckert to come and to speak on the historical context of St. Teresa.
To just give you a kind of a capsule of where we're going, Teresa's world is going to include several important elements. We're going to talk a lot about Spain, and then also the church as it was universally, and the Spanish church itself. And then we're going to talk a bit about the Renaissance and the emphasis on the individual person. It's important to realize that Teresa was a daughter of the Renaissance period. This was a time when there was a great emphasis on individual excellence. Now, some people criticize the Renaissance as being neo-paganism, or something that went haywire because there was too much emphasis on ancient institutions, and that it was actually a kind of a resurrection of the old Greco-Roman world that had no room for God. Not really true. The Renaissance itself took advantage of the rediscovery not only of ancient pagan texts, but ancient Christian texts as well. And the emphasis on the individual person is going to reflect not so much a humanism that was narcissistic, but a humanism that emphasized the individual as the pinnacle of God's creation. And if you just stop and think about it, where was most of the great Renaissance art produced? It was in the churches. And it was using biblical themes, gospel themes, personifications of virtues, and other elements that were very much part and parcel of Christianity. So for the people who want to equate humanism with paganism, your proper reaction to that is to laugh, because it simply wasn't true. In the Renaissance, one of the best sellers was a book called The Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione. And Castiglione emphasized the fact that men and women should develop multiple talents and many different skills and abilities, so that they would be able to converse wisely and charmingly with anyone on any subject. So educated people were expected to learn languages, to study theology, to be able to be aware of breakthroughs in science. They were expected to be able to discuss diplomacy or literature or multiple different things. This is the world that Teresa grew up in. And as you know, she was an incredibly versatile woman. So I think she was very much a very good daughter of the Renaissance. Okay, those three things, Spain, the church, and the Renaissance emphasis on the individual. These are the categories that I'm hoping to toss around for you today. Okay, to begin with, we have a period in which the Spanish Empire had begun with the voyages of Columbus, and once he discovered that it was possible to travel to and from the Western Hemisphere successfully, it also meant that he was going to be able to open up the riches of the Americas for exploration and settlement by people from Spain. Now, we look upon this in later times as something that was not necessarily a good thing, especially for the civilizations of the Native Americans who were already here, because essentially this intersection of civilizations was not absolutely equal. And the net result, unfortunately, was the near annihilation of the various American civilizations. But let's remember also that that was not intended by the Spaniards of that age. This was something that basically happened by accident. There's no rhyme or reason why they would want to destroy the Indian civilizations, because they already had control of them. They were more likely to want them to grow and flourish and produce wealth, because many of the Spaniards who went to the New World primarily went there to get rich. But let's backpedal a little bit. In Teresa's world, the Spain of her time, in recent living memory, had just been united for the first time since the Roman Empire. Remember that Spain was under the control of Muslims for 700 years, at least parts of Spain. And the monarchs who eventually expelled the last of the Muslims from the little kingdom of Granada did so because they were seeking a sense of unity in this newly united state. The same thing happened in the United States once the Revolutionary War ended. You've got 13 very individual thinking colonies who now were essentially being asked to give up their autonomy in favor of one United States. There's always the question, do we talk about the United States as plural or as singular? Is it one country, or is it a conglomerate of the states themselves? In the world that Teresa lived in, the church in Spain pervaded everything. It was just incredibly important. And as you can see, the clear signal from the church that we can claim to have today was nowhere in sight during Teresa's day. Nobody ever thought about a separation of church and state. It was assumed that they lived together and that they were involved with one another. So we're going to be heavily politically and socially involved between the church and everything else. And then the great emphasis on the individual is what you just heard me talk about. Now, if you look at this map, this looks at the Iberian Peninsula with 5 separate states. Portugal, of course, will remain independent, thanks to Nuno Alvarez Pereira, another great Carmelite. And you have the 2 principal Spanish kingdoms, Castile and Leon in the center, That's Teresa's area. And then Aragon on the Mediterranean coast. Aragon is green, Castile is red here. You have the little kingdom of Navarre up in the Pyrenees, which will join up later. And then at the very bottom, you have the remnant of the Muslim kingdom of Granada. During this period, we're going to have a great deal of development in warfare. This is extremely important for the growth of Spain because it's going to represent one of the great advantages that the Spaniards had. They developed a military system that made use of gunpowder in a way that so far no one else in the world was able to harness. The gunpowder weapons of Teresa's time were either cannon, which were so big and heavy that they were almost immobile on the battlefield. But then we also have the earliest muskets, which were very heavy, very slow firing, and a musketeer who was trying to hold this 20-pound monster and load it and fire it at the same time was extremely vulnerable to either cavalry or infantry charging in and had to be protected somehow. Well, there was a Spanish captain by the name of Gonzalo de Cordoba who figured out a way to integrate the old medieval pikes, just very long spears for infantrymen, together with the musketeers to come up with a military system called the tercio that was based on the Roman legion. And this was a Spanish invention that made the Spanish forces nearly invincible for the next 150 years. Now, concerning back to the Moorish conquest of Spain, this happened in the year 711. This was when an army of Berbers and Arabs from North Africa hopped across the Strait of Gibraltar to a big rocky promontory that became their toehold, and they very quickly flooded through the rest of the Iberian Peninsula and conquered nearly everything all the way to the very top of the peninsula. There were only a few tiny areas that were held out by Christian forces, and from 711 onward, we're going to have those 700 years of domination by the Muslims. You can see that in the 9th century, the map on the left has the Christian-controlled areas in blue, very minor, as you can see. A lot of it very mountainous and rugged, which wasn't very good for producing wealth, but it was very good for defending areas against hostile forces. If you look at the dotted line in blue that goes through the center of Spain, that was the boundary by about 1200. The Christian forces had gradually been able to reconquer portions of that, and by the time that Spain was ripe for unification, if you look at the map on the right, you have the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon fusing together as an unbreakable alliance, and they then take on the Kingdom of Granada, which you see there at the very bottom. That was the last Muslim toehold in Spain. And when that was finally captured, the Muslim years in Spain were at an end. Now, this is your summary right here. At the top, 711, the Muslim general Tariq is the one who leads the invasion from Morocco. That rock that he grabbed at first was then known as Tariq's Rock, or Jebel Tariq. We called it Gibraltar. From that point onward, they flooded north very quickly, sweeping everything in their path. The town of Avila was occupied 3 years later. Eventually, Avila was freed by the King of Castile, Alfonso VI. And it's interesting that during that early period, the ruling dynasty of the Muslim state in Spain was the Umayyad dynasty that had been refugees from another Muslim dynasty that had overthrown them. They fled to Spain, set up what in many ways was a model kingdom, very tolerant, Muslims, Jews, Christians, all living alongside of one another, perfect harmony, well, not perfect, but passable harmony. The Muslims brought good government. They brought a lot of great advantages in agriculture, like irrigation systems and wonderful new crops like almonds and avocados and good things from North Africa and the Middle East. And that was really part of the medieval golden age of Spain. But the Umayyads sadly died out by 1037. They were replaced by one dynasty from Morocco and then another, both of whom were rather fundamentalistic. They were less tolerant of Jews and Christians. They were very eager to promote Islam, whether the people they were trying to attract wanted it or not. And so this is going to stimulate the Christian resistance to what had been a fairly good Muslim state to live in. So the local kingdoms, and there were many of them in Spain, the Christian kingdoms, they finally begin to see that there would be advantage to cooperating with each other as opposed to their normal history, which was perpetual bickering. And by this time, there were several military orders that were formed in Spain. You know about the orders that were formed in the Holy Land during the Crusades, like the Hospitallers of St. John and the Templars. Well, in Spain, you have three military orders, Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara. These three orders, these were professional fighting knights who also were religious. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They had a prayer schedule. They had community life like any other religious order. It's just that their ministry was fighting. Not with each other, which set them apart from some orders. Now, these military orders were very important because this was a Christian military component of the effort against the Muslims, which did not demobilize and go home after every battle. The other knights did that. So kings and princes who were trying to field an army that would be fairly permanent, they really needed those military orders. And they served quite well, to be honest. The sad part is that the more successful the military orders were, the more of their own power and control that they were able to absorb, and they were actually sources of power and sometimes resistance to a king or a queen who might have a longer range plan that could be very good. So this was a kind of a mixed blessing. Now, it all comes to a conclusion in the year 1212 at a battle called Las Navas de Tolosa. Nobody's ever heard of this, but it's one of the decisive battles in the history of the world. This was a time when there was a truce in the Holy Land. The regular crusades in and around Jerusalem were 10 years off by common agreement. So any Muslims who really wanted to fight against Christians came to Spain. One of those Moroccan dynasties was putting together what you could call a foreign legion of fighters from all over the Muslim world to try to take back some of that territory the Christians had reconquered. By the same token, there were Christian volunteers that were flooding into Spain to help the armies of Castile and Leon and Aragon. And so this was going to be a rather colossal clash of forces from both sides. To summarize quickly, the Christians swept the battlefield. This was a resounding victory, and the Muslims were badly defeated to such a degree that Moroccan dynasty was very quickly replaced and lost power. And then it looked as though nothing had happened, because everybody went home and the territory of control was pretty much the same as it had been. But in fact, everything had changed. From this point on, the initiative was on the part of the Christians. And it was going to be a slow rollback of Muslim-controlled territory until there was nothing left. So this is one of those events that really ought to be better known because of its significance. The final end came in 1492. The last Muslim dynasty, the Nasrids, who were actually very peaceful, they realized they didn't have the power to survive unless they kept their heads down and smiled a lot. They were finally defeated by a combined army of Aragon and Castile and expelled from the Kingdom of Granada. So you have three very easy dates to remember. 7-Eleven, someone immediately said, what a great name for a chain of convenience stores. And then 12-12, and then 1492. You didn't realize Spanish history was going to be so easy, did you? Now, after this reunion of not only Castile and Aragon, but Granada as well, with Navarre catching up at about the time Teresa was born, you have, for the first time, a real kingdom that could be called Spain. These were the people that did the job. You have Ferdinand of Aragon, who marries Isabella of Castile. The two of them not only make a marriage alliance, but they make an agreement with their respective kingdoms that from now on they will rule jointly over both. Please note that they were smart enough to not do an instant merger of the kingdoms, because many of the citizens in both kingdoms were quite convinced they could never get along with the nincompoops next door. There was a lot of resistance to a merger. And so Ferdinand and Isabella hoped that they would both live for many years and that there would be some time to kind of soften the resistance, to overcome the negativity of putting two kingdoms into one, and that just the success of cooperation would convince most of their citizens that perhaps one Spain was a good idea. And if they lived long enough, even the ones who were hard to reconcile might start to die off. Well, all of that worked. And so, dating from their royal wedding in 1469, you've got this joint rule in which both Ferdinand and Isabella cooperated with policy. They discussed everything they did with one another and some good advisors, and eventually thrashed out most of the troubles that would have prevented one united Spanish kingdom. Now, the plan was always that their children would inherit one kingdom, not two, and that from this point onward, that they would seal that bargain by eliminating the last non-Spanish control in the south. So, Kingdom of Granada is eliminated very early in the year that a sort of crack-brained Genoese came to the two of them and proposed this idea about getting to the east by sailing west. You know, what a dumb thought. But he caught Ferdinand and Isabella in a really good mood. And not only that, but they had money, which they gave to him. And he convinced them that, here's a good tidbit for you. After 1492, the Muslims are gone from Spain. So the crusading tax that had been collected in both kingdoms no longer had a reason to be collected. So Columbus pointed out that if we can extend the crusade to Asia and make friends of the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians, they might be good allies against the Muslims, you can keep collecting the tax. And of course, crowned heads never want to give up a tax, and so Columbus got what he wanted. So, just to sort of give you a recap, here are the two big kingdoms, the one they conquer and the one they later absorb. It's interesting to note that in this new combined kingdom, they had not yet designated Madrid as the capital. Toledo was the functional capital of Castile, which was by far the biggest and most powerful kingdom. But essentially, they moved around a lot. The capital was wherever the king and queen were. And so, in the case of Columbus in 1492, he goes to talk to them. They're in Granada, in their command tent after the battle was finished. By the time he sailed to the Western Hemisphere and came back, he had to report into the people who funded the voyage. Well, by that time, they were way around in Barcelona on the Mediterranean coast. And so that's where he went to tell them what he had discovered. Now, the centralization under Ferdinand and Isabella is going to be a very important component in 16th century Spain. Teresa was very much aware that they wanted to centralize and strengthen the royal government at all costs. And there were many good reasons for that. Remember those three military orders. They were separate sources of power until Ferdinand convinced them that, all right, each of you, we want you to be team players. When your grandmaster dies or when your grandmaster retires, you are cordially encouraged to elect me, Ferdinand of Aragon, your grandmaster. So very quickly, that's how he got control of these separate focuses of power. You see what I'm leading to here. And the Spanish Inquisition, which was reinstituted in 1478 with permission of Pope Sixtus IV, the one the Sistine Chapel is named after. This was also a royal institution, not controlled by the church, but by the crown, and people appointed by the monarchs to govern the church and make sure that not only orthodoxy, but good practice was guaranteed. This is also going to be a great complication. Even bishops and archbishops are going to be subject to the Inquisition. Not always a very happy outcome. Teresa and John were inspected by the Inquisition. They never found anything, but essentially it was a way of convincing creative people that they needed to mind every word that they said and keep their heads down, because the Inquisition had rather terrifying powers. You know Teresa's bad experience with her first autobiography that the Inquisition wanted to read and never gave back. That's a case in point. One of the good guys in all of this, for the most part, at least 90% positive, was a Franciscan friar by the name of Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros. He was a very good, noble individual who wanted nothing except to be a good Franciscan. But he was also confessor and chaplain to Isabella, and she was so impressed with him that essentially she pushed him through all sorts of promotions, not only as Archbishop of Toledo, but also eventually getting a red hat and becoming the reformer of the entire Spanish church. Jimenez did an incredible job of solving many of the problems that caused the Protestant Reformation, but a generation earlier than Luther in Spain. This is why Spain was not open to most Protestant ideas. They'd already had their reform, and when it comes time for something like the Council of Trent, Spain and Portugal are going to have some of the most reformed bishops that will help the rest of the church to get its game together and root out the corruption that had been such a massive problem. This is the same cardinal who also insisted that the image of a strong, unified Catholic Spain, not containing Muslims and Jews, in other words, would be a good idea. Now, this is one of the areas where Jimenez, for all of the good things that he did, somewhat went off the rails. Any people who had been practicing either Islam or Judaism were now encouraged under very severe penalties to either convert to Catholicism or leave the country. And there were large numbers who did both. The focus on a totally Catholic unified state was so great that the Jews were pressured almost immediately after the Battle of Granada. Maybe 200,000 of them emigrated to other places, but large numbers of Jews did, in fact, convert to Catholicism. The Muslims' turn came later in 1502. Again, large numbers of them left for North Africa or the Middle East or the Ottoman Empire. But likewise, there were many Muslims who accepted baptism and Christianity. Now, the converted Jews were known as conversos. The converted Muslims were known as moriscos. And they continued to be identified as these recent converts because in the general public eye, most people didn't trust them. Basically, they said, well, yes, you've become Christian, but you didn't really mean it, did you? You were doing this under pressure. You were doing this under duress, and so we don't believe you're really Christian. One of the things the Inquisition was perpetually on the lookout for was people who would lapse into old Jewish or Muslim practices. For example, you know that Jews are not allowed to mix meat and milk products in a single meal. All right, well, if a housewife is going to be cooking dinner, Jewish women would not use butter to cook meat for that reason. So it was automatic that any woman, no matter what she looked like or what her background, who was using olive oil to brown some meat for dinner was suddenly suspect. Is this a Jewish relapse, for example? I like olive oil. Now, of course, the gift that Columbus gave to Ferdinand and Isabella was incredible. He opened up the Americas to exploration, exploitation, and settlement. And among the people who are going to be going to the New World to seek their fortunes and in many cases earn a fortune would be some of Teresa's brothers and cousins and other relatives. They're going to, in many cases, become fabulously wealthy. But also keep your eye on the fact that in the first half of the century, the American exploration is going to raise the domestic life in Spain to a very high new level. But toward the end of the century, there's going to actually be a drain of population from Spain because so many people are flooding to Mexico or Peru and getting extremely rich there. But unfortunately, towns like Avila are actually going to be losing population, and therefore productive people and the ability to generate wealth and so forth. So economically, Spain is going to be ascending during the first half of the century, more or less, and at just about the time that Teresa begins her reform, it's also going to begin to decline somewhat, in spite of the fact that there was a fabulous amount of gold and silver that was now in circulation. Remember earlier on I mentioned Gonzalo de Cordoba, who instituted a military system that integrated muskets and pikes. You see several pikemen there with these very long defensive weapons. They are in a position of defending against cavalry or, if necessary, an attack of infantry. Around this solid core of pikemen, you now have the ability of musketeers with their very slow-firing weapons to shelter inside that hedge of steel points with concentrations of them on the corners, so that in this protected hedge, where they're not in as much danger, even if they're firing slowly, they can be putting out a great deal of firepower with those muskets. And this turns out to be a military system that other people tried to copy, but it's going to be a nearly invincible system. The Spanish army is pretty much going to dominate Europe and the Americas for the next 150 years. Now, when I talk about Spanish army, it's not all soldiers who are Spaniards. There were Italians, French, Flemish, Irish, Scots, Germans, many other people, but they were following the Spanish system. And this is the man who is going to be the main beneficiary of that. This is Philip II. He is the great-grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. He was truly one of the great kings of Spain, although a mixed blessing of virtues. We can agree that he probably had his heart in the right place. He wanted to make Spain not only supreme in the world, but the great champion of Reformed Catholicism. There's nothing wrong with that. But he was a micromanager. He insisted on being in on every single detail of everything that happened in Spain, including parts of the Teresian reform. And he's not a Carmelite. So, what does he know about Carmelite tradition that he feels free to tamper in anything? Well, I'm king of Spain and I've got a really good army. Sincerely Catholic, but essentially a vindictive religious fanatic. He didn't like Giovanni Battista Rossi, the Carmelite general, because he was Italian. He didn't like the Council of Trent because he thought they were too permissive. Spain can be tougher. Spain will be better Catholics than that whole series of popes and the whole bunch at Trent. So we've got a complication here, which many of you who've done your reading already know about. All right, this is Avila, known as Avila of the Knights, because there was a settlement of many of the knights who had struggled against the Muslim forces. And those very impressive walls are still there as a remnant of the time of the struggle. Now, at the time of Teresa, this is pretty much the way that society divided itself in Avila. These were highly stratified classes. At the very top, you always have your hereditary aristocracy. These are the people with titles, usually great land holdings, and of course a great deal of bragging rights because of their family history. These are the old warrior families that had helped to expel the Muslims, and they never let anybody forget it. One notch down from them, you have a second layer that included merchants who didn't have the great honor or the titles of the aristocracy, but sometimes they had more money. Now, of course, money didn't count in the prestige game, but those are going to be important people that, especially during this first half of Teresa's century, are actually going to be gaining influence and, to use the Chicago word, clout in Avila society. You also have professionals, doctors, lawyers, educated people of all sorts who are going to also be in the upswing. And then finally you have a good number of lower clergy. This includes not only your ordinary diocesan priests, but many of the religious orders as well. Remember, this is the century when the Jesuits are founded and very quickly rocket to a position of high prestige because of their discipline and their knowledge. And so this second group is actually going to be encroaching on the privileges and the sway of the aristocracy. Now, below them, you have the so-called lower classes, the working classes. Most of the artisans in Avila were carters, dyers, weavers, people in the textile industry, because one of the great products of Avila was high-quality woolen cloth. Then, of course, you have the peasants in the countryside, the ones that nobody can live without because they are the main food producers. And at the bottom of the heap, you have the shepherds, who are actually producing the sheep that are giving Avila its great wealth. So this is the world that Teresa lived in. Her family is going to be right here. She doesn't qualify as old aristocracy because, remember, her family's title was a new one. And so, this was something that she always knew that, the family was kind of in that second rank, although they looked really good. Now, at about the time that Teresa was born, there were only 4,600 people in the town. It was going to grow a little bit, but then remember, it's going to decline toward the end of the century. That second rank will benefit from the stability of the new United Kingdom, the prosperity of just ordinary hard work, and the flood of gold and silver that was coming in from the New World. So the merchants were now going to be able to sort of crowd their way into the leadership contingent. Now, for us, here's a very interesting point. Religious houses were all over the place. there were many, many, many religious communities all over Spain for men and women, and Avila had a rather large share of that. Some people would have said too many. And the great complication for these religious communities is that practically all of them had patrons. These were usually aristocratic families that had paid a great deal of money to the convent or the monastery, and they more or less claimed special rights in helping to regulate this religious house. Whoever pays the piper calls the tune. That was their argument. And it was a kind of accepted fact that anyone that the patron wanted to be admitted to the community, whether or not they had what you and I would call a vocation, would be accepted. Now, of course, this was going to be one of the bigger problems in Teresa's house. They also had a great deal of influence in selecting the superiors. Now, certainly among the mendicant orders, both men and women, superiors were elected. But the patrons would tell them who to elect. And then finally, the patrons would usually claim the right of being buried in the churches or chapels of the community so that the community could pray for the souls of that family forever and ever and ever and ever. And in many cases, they put conditions on the community that they had to offer so many masses per year, sometimes one every day, and there had to be prayers that the community would offer for the souls of the deceased members of the family. Now, those tend to be good things, but in some cases, we have religious houses of women where there had to be one sister in the chapel at all times, day and night, 24/7, praying for the family, and they had to be doing it out loud. This is oral prayer so that any member of the family could pop into the chapel at any time and demand that there would be a sister that was there praying out loud for their ancestors. Now, nobody wants to say that praying for your benefactors is a bad thing. But this system implies something that is numerical and very probably superstitious. You know, if one Mass is good, 10 Masses are better. This is the philosophy that's behind them. It's piling up prayers and has nothing to do with anything that Teresa would recognize as lifting the heart and mind to God. Okay, we know about Teresa's dirty little secret. Her grandfather had been a Jewish convert. He was one of those conversos. And it was accepted that the old Catholics would always be extremely proud of their pure blood, and anybody who had the trace of tainted blood from a Jewish or Muslim ancestor was considered to be just irretrievably lost, not worth associating with, and certainly not fit for the leadership circle. Well, Teresa's grandfather was a serious enough Catholic. He was not insincere in any way, but he managed to come to Avila to get away from the reputation that he had as a converso back in Toledo. So in order to try to start over, essentially, he comes to a new place, works on getting a title of nobility, and essentially was able to successfully start over again. But of course, the members of the family knew, and you see in some of Teresa's work that she's very conscious of not letting that slip out, because this would essentially take away some of her credibility and some of her capability of being able to speak with authority on religious matters. In addition to that, some of the other things she was up against, just being a woman assumed that she was not supposed to be a leader, but just a meek follower, that prayer in a nun's convent should be liturgical prayer only. Her idea of methodic mental prayer or any kind of quiet personal encounter with God was seen as something to be viewed with suspicion. Because, if it's not out loud, if nobody can supervise this, God only knows what you're doing in the recesses of your own mind. This was considered to be somewhat dangerous. There was a group known as the Alumbrados, the illuminated ones. These were a very mixed bag of men and women who were promoting interior prayer and so forth. Some of them really were nutty as a fruitcake. Most of them were harmless, and some of them were extremely good, holy people. And there was always the danger, according to observers of Teresa and her movement, that Teresa herself might be an alumbrada. And as she's promoting the idea of personal quiet prayer, not audible to any human, not part of her liturgical prayer with the rest of the sisters, this is simply something we don't know whether it's good or bad. So much better to kind of squash the whole idea. Well, remember that the Renaissance is a time of individuality. So that older idea of suspicion that individuals have to be a collective to be accepted is not widely bought by especially the more educated part of society. Humanism, you heard me talk about this earlier on, and this is something that is not only going to stimulate Teresa's life of prayer, but this is also a time for reform of many orders, not just the Carmelites, but there were several Franciscan reforms that were very positive. This is the time when the Jesuits are founded on a whole new set of principles. And so, Teresa isn't the only one who was stressing the possibility that maybe just the old-fashioned blah, blah, blah prayer in chapel is not the way to go. Among the other strains of the time, you know about the Rhineland mystics and the Flemish mystics of the previous century. These were people who followed the so-called Devotio Moderna. And please remind yourselves that the Netherlands and parts of the Rhineland and Burgundy were part of the Spanish Empire at this time. As a matter of fact, the father of King Philip II, Emperor Charles V, had grown up in Belgium. He wasn't all that well accepted in Spain because his Spanish had this Dutch, Flemish, German accent to it, and they never quite accepted him as one of their own. Now, as far as the Carmelites in Spain, remember that there were no women's communities in the Carmelite order until the time of John Soreth. You see his dates there, 1451 to 71. John Soreth opened the door to not only women's communities, but lay people following the Carmelite charism as well. There were 12 women's communities in various parts of Spain by the time that Teresa's reform hit the ground. Some of those were extremely good in their observance, including midnight office, fairly strict discipline, very high quality spirituality for the nuns in those communities. Teresa's own community, sadly, was not one of the better ones. And all of them, please note, at this point, were beaterios. In other words, these were generic communities for religious women. They were not necessarily considered to be strictly cloistered with an enclosure and strict discipline. The Incarnation Convent, it didn't have an enclosure because nobody ever told them that they should. It was, one of those early times where things were a little bit wild and woolly. To be quite honest, the community that Teresa moved into had many of the problems of the town itself. And everything that we said about the patronage, about people being admitted to the house without a real vocation, and having too many sisters for the finances, that's all going to come back in spades to haunt her community. At one point, there were 180 nuns in this one single community. And many of them were simply noble ladies who had not gotten married by a certain age, and so the families simply say, well, she's a liability, she's going to be an embarrassment to us, so we will dump her into a convent and give them a lot of money to keep her. Now, people of that sort, these are not evil women, but they're not religious either. They're simply living in a convent, and many of them have servants or slaves with them. They have their own cooks. They have friends coming to visit and parlors to sit down and gossip about people in town day in and day out. This is not the sort of atmosphere that you need in a religious house. Now, to give them some credit, the sisters' communities were not immoral and evil. Because remember that they were all fairly recent foundations. Many of the friars' communities had become immoral because they were much older. They had more centuries to go to rot and ruin. But they were going to be moving along in spite of those difficulties. So, Teresa takes the bull by the horns. There were good things that she was learning in this convent, including the elements of the Carmelite tradition. There were also things that she looked around and saw that she said, I'll never do this. So she's learning good and bad things to do, things not to do. This is the original Carmelite foundation in the Wadi. And Teresa became aware through a book called the Book of the First Monks of this hermit's way of life in which they would cluster around the chapel and come together for Mass every day and for various meetings. But most of the life that they lived was silence and solitude and individual prayer. She basically said, we need to get back to something like this. So, being aware of that book, she began to focus on what will help us to get back to the prayer style of Elijah and Mary. They are the ideals. And the routine numerical prayer even the liturgical prayer without proper attention is not helpful. So, the plan begins to go together. She gets permission for the Convent of San Jose, and it's important that this foundation was authorized in poverty. That term for her experimental community in 1562 means that there were no patrons to give the money for this. The house would depend on donations freely given by people who believed in what she was doing. So, you know the details, I think. If the primary activity is prayer, we don't want patrons to be telling the nuns what they should do. We simplify everything that happens. We have a community that's small enough so that everyone can be friends. Now, eventually, she meets with Giovanni Battista Rossi, the general. He gives her permission to found as many houses as she has hairs on her head, as long as she can find nuns to live in them. This is going to be the beginning of the explosion of the Teresian reform. I know you can't see this map, but it's a good one. It shows all of the various travels of Teresa. And by the time she gets along in her foundations, her writing is going to keep pace with this, especially after a slight interval in 1575, when she goes to the house in Toledo and finishes off her long career of writing. So essentially, this is what I have to say about Spain in that century and how Teresa fits into it. We have many other experts who are going to fill in more details for you, but I hope this gives you a good background. Thank you.